My mother didn't just kick me out, she replaced me. One day I was her son, the next I was a problem she solved by pushing me out the door so she could play perfect family with the man she really wanted, and the twins she said deserved a better life than me. I walked away at 16 with nothing but a backpack and the kind of pain you don't outgrow, you just learn to carry it differently. For 12 years she never called, never checked if I survived the nights I went to bed hungry or the days I worked myself raw just to stay in school. But the moment she heard I'd made something of myself, she showed up at my door like she still had a claim on me, demanding I pay for my siblings' college. She expected the scared boy she abandoned. She froze when she met the man I had become. My name is Alder Knox, and this is the part of my life I never thought I'd talk about aloud. But before I share my story with you, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even one person listening makes the weight feel lighter. And if stories like this matter to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps this channel grow and it lets me know I'm not telling these memories into an empty room. Thank you. Now, let me tell you everything. I got home later than usual that evening, the kind of late where the sun had already lost its color but the heat still clung to the air like it didn't want to leave. Austin summers always felt that way, heavy, sticky, breathless. I stepped out of the elevator with my work shirt still half untucked, laptop bag slung across my shoulder, my mind replaying the morning's strategy meeting for maybe the 10th time. I just wanted a shower, a cold drink, and silence. But when I turned the corner and saw someone standing in front of my door, everything inside me tightened. The figure had her back to me, shoulders hunched, fingers clenched around the straps of a worn handbag. For a split second I thought it might be a neighbor or a delivery issue until she turned. And just like that, 12 years collapsed onto my chest. Mom. The word slipped out before I could stop it. It wasn't joy I felt. It was the sudden drop in my stomach, like someone had yanked open a sealed room inside me. Maribel looked older, hollow cheeks gray threading through her hair, but her eyes were exactly the same. That familiar mix of accusation and expectation, as though she'd been wronged and I owed her something for it. I froze right there in the hallway, torn between turning back to the elevator or unlocking my door and pretending I wasn't unraveling inside. I never thought I'd see her again. I'd built an entire life around not seeing her again. I heard you got promoted, she said, smiling like we'd never skipped a single holiday, birthday, or milestone. I kept my distance. How did you find my address? She waved the question away, mumbling something about hearing it from a relative. No name, no details, just enough to dodge responsibility. She didn't look ashamed or apologetic, just impatient, as if I were the one taking too long to invite her inside. And that was the only reason I unlocked the door. Not because I wanted to, but because the hallway was too exposed, too public. I didn't want my neighbors listening to the kind of family drama people used to whisper about in grocery stores. Inside, she immediately scanned my apartment. Modern furniture, clean lines, shelves filled with tech books, no photos of family anywhere. I saw her assessing it all, not with pride, but calculation, measuring success by what she could see rather than by what I had survived. I handed her a glass of water. My fingers trembled, but my voice stayed calm. So she said, crossing her legs, you never thought to call me first before all this. I almost laughed. Instead, I said I thought we agreed to go our separate ways more than a decade ago. Her face twisted, wounded but indignant. You've always been so sensitive. I did the best I could. You don't know how hard it was to raise you alone. I didn't respond, but in my head everything started replaying her voice, telling me to pack my things. Graham avoiding my eyes, the twins crying in the background while I tried not to. Then she cut straight to the reason she came. Levi and Lyndon are getting ready for college, she said. They need their older brother to step up. The words struck me harder than I expected. I remembered holding them when they were newborns, tiny fists grabbing my shirt. They were 16 now, my age, when she told me I didn't belong in her new family. She launched into a rehearsed story about Graham's failed business, their debts bills piling up, how unfair life had been lately. The whole narrative painted them as victims of circumstance and me as the solution. Then came the twist, the tone shift that turned her request into a command. This is your responsibility now, she said. A real brother would help his family. I stared at her, stunned not by the request but by her audacity. My family, I asked quietly. The same family I was told I didn't belong to. She tightened her jaw. That was a long time ago. You should understand. Things weren't equal then. We had to prioritize. Prioritize, I repeated. Do you remember who paid for my college? Who worked nights? Who took out loans because it wasn't you? She waved it off like it was a minor inconvenience from some forgotten chapter. We were struggling, you have to understand. And that was the moment it clicked for me. Not the request, not the debt, not the past. It was the realization that she didn't think she had ever done anything wrong. To her, everything that happened was justified, logical, fair. I looked at her and wondered how someone who had pushed me out of her life so decisively now felt entitled to walk into mine and demand a place. She sat straighter as if waiting for me to agree. But all I could think was, how does someone who cast me out at 16 dare to show up here and talk about responsibility? And that was when I knew I couldn't move forward until I faced what happened the first time she closed the door on me. Everything in me shifted, pulling me back to the beginning. To the night I realized I was the disposable child. I took a breath and let the memory open. To understand the way I shut every door on my mother, you'd need to see the first time she shut one on me. I was 16, living in Seattle with her and Graham. The twins Levi and Lyndon were 6 months old, loud and constantly demanding attention. The house buzzed with feeding schedules and diaper changes, but somehow for me it was the quietest place I'd ever lived. A silence that came from being unseen. It hadn't always been like that. From 0 to 9, back when it was just the two of us in Portland, she used to work night shifts as a nurse. My grandparents watched me most nights, but every morning she'd crawl into bed beside me and whisper, "As long as we have each other, that's enough." I clung to that sentence like it was a promise. It took me years to realize it was only temporary, a placeholder, until she found something better. Graham entered the picture when I was 9. At first, he played the part: movie tickets, little gifts, weekend outings. But as their relationship became serious, he and my mother started having conversations I wasn't included in. Conversations that felt like planning sessions for a future I wouldn't be a part of. When they married, we moved to Seattle. New school, new neighborhood, new expectations. None of which I had any say in. But the real shift happened when I was 13, the day she told me she was pregnant with twins. I remember being genuinely happy for her. I thought this was the moment she'd finally get the complete family she wanted, and that maybe I'd be allowed to belong to it. Instead, everything I did became a problem. If I closed a door too loudly, I was stressing her out. If I ate the last of something, I was inconsiderate. She blamed me for her discomfort, her lack of sleep, even her mood swings. So I tried harder. I cleaned, cooked, carried heavy grocery bags, helped Graham with whatever he needed. But no matter how much I did, the look in her eyes shifted from frustration to resentment. And then came the night she went into severe pain. Graham wasn't home, so I called 911, rode with her in the ambulance, held her hand through every contraction. She squeezed so tightly my knuckles turned white. But the second Graham walked into the hospital room, she let go. "I can't stand him anymore," she whispered to him while I stood right there. "He just makes everything worse." That was the moment I understood. I wasn't part of her new life. I was a remnant of the old one. When the twins were born, I stepped fully into the role of caregiver, feeding, changing, rocking. But outside the house, she introduced us as a family of 5, never acknowledging I was her son. I overheard her tell a friend the older one is basically like a nephew we're helping out. I was disappearing. The breaking point came one night in the kitchen. The dishes were drying, the TV murmured from the living room, and she called me in with a tone that made my stomach drop. Graham sat stiffly at the table. They said raising 3 kids was too expensive, that the house felt crowded, that they were under pressure. I offered everything a job after school, covering my own expenses, keeping out of the way. I asked for nothing but a place to sleep. Graham stared at the table. My mother didn't hesitate. "You're 16, she said. "You should understand that the twins need us more." But then came the sentence that cleaved my world in two. "Levi and Lyndon deserve to be here more than you. You're older, You'll be fine. Deserve. Not need. Deserve. In that moment, I realized exactly where I stood in her hierarchy. I wasn't a son. I was an optional item on a budget sheet. I didn't argue. There was no point. The decision had been made long before this conversation, maybe even before the twins were born. The next morning, my bags were packed and waiting in the hallway. Graham told me staying with my grandparents would be better for everyone. My mother kept her back turned scrubbing dishes like she was afraid of what might happen if she faced me. I looked at the twins in their crib, not knowing when I would see them again. As I pulled my suitcase toward the door, I heard her whisper, quiet but clear enough. Now we can finally focus on the children who really matter. In that sentence, we no longer included me. And that was the day I stopped being her son. The night I left Seattle, I rode a bus with 2 suitcases and a knot in my throat I couldn't swallow down. By the time I reached my grandparents' small house in Salem, the air had turned cold, and the lavender bushes behind the porch were swaying like they recognized me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the warm light spilling from the window, telling myself that at least someone in this world still opened the door when I knocked. My grandparents were shocked when they learned what happened, but not enough to confront my mother. They didn't want to lose the little time they still had with the twins, and I understood that. So I just told them I'd manage, and I meant it. I promised myself right then that this house would be a stop, not a place to collapse. A week later, I found a night shift job at a local supermarket. Stocking shelves, unloading pallets in the back, cleaning spills, counting inventory. I didn't care what the job was. It was money, and it was mine. Every night after the last bus ride home, I'd step into the quiet street feeling strangely relieved. No crying babies, no slammed doors, no accusations about being too loud, too needy, too much. Just silence and my own tired steps. Part of my paycheck went to my grandparents for utilities. The rest I saved. A few crumpled bills at a time, dreaming that one day I'd get out of Oregon and start over in a place where my name didn't feel like a mistake. One night, as I was walking past the living room, I heard my grandparents whispering. I stopped when I heard my father's name, Silas. My grandmother said my mother had refused child support from him when I was a baby. She'd said she didn't want ties to a man who didn't want her. I remember feeling as if the floor under my feet shifted. My mother had always painted the picture that we struggled because he abandoned us. I'd spent my whole childhood believing she'd done everything alone, that every sleepless night and every empty fridge was his fault. But learning that she had turned down financial help that could have made both our lives easier, rewrote every story she'd ever told me about sacrifice. It wasn't just life that had been cruel. Some of it had been her choices. At 17, I started applying to colleges. I wanted out of Salem, out of the shadow of my mother's decisions, out of the version of myself that felt permanently second place. I built my portfolio, wrote essays, requested recommendations. I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. When I called my mother to ask if she could co-sign my student loan, or at least stand as a secondary guarantor, she shut it down immediately. I have to protect my credit for Levi and Lyndon, she said. I can't risk my financial standing. She didn't ask what schools I'd gotten into or how much money I needed. She didn't even ask how I'd been. That was when it became clear she wasn't just choosing my brothers. She was choosing the version of the family she wanted, and I wasn't in it. My last option was Vernon, my dad's younger brother, a man I'd met maybe twice in my life. I sat across from him at a diner in Salem, my documents spread out on the table. He read through them carefully, silently, then finally looked at me and said, "If you promise you'll never let this fall back on me, I'll sign." I nodded so hard my neck hurt. The moment his pen touched the paper, something in my chest unlocked. For the first time, an adult chose to invest in me without expecting something in return. Move-in day at the University of Washington in Seattle was a circus of families carrying boxes, parents giving pep talks, siblings bickering. People hugged, cried, took photos. And there I was, dragging 2 suitcases across a crowded hallway, assembling my bed alone, hanging my own light fixture. My phone stayed silent the entire day. No good luck text, no call, not even a missed one. When I finished setting up my tiny room, I stared out the window at the campus below and murmured to myself, "At least no one can kick me out of here unless I stop paying rent." College life was brutal in the way survival often is. Morning classes, afternoon shifts at the library, evening shifts at a fast food joint, late-night study groups, weekend overnight shifts. My planner didn't have white space, just arrows pointing from one obligation to the next. I didn't have much bandwidth to think about family. But certain moments still stung, like watching classmates introduce their parents during orientation or hearing them complain about nagging moms. I wanted to tell them how lucky they were to be nagged. Then one afternoon, a friend sent me a link to a social media post and casually asked, "Isn't this your mom?" Her profile photo was a smiling picture of her with Graham and the twins on a beach in California. Every album was filled with trips, birthday cakes, matching outfits, holidays surrounded by decorations and joy. Under her bio, the line that hit me hardest: proud mom of 2 amazing boys. 2, not 3. It didn't feel like being forgotten. It felt like being erased. I graduated 4 years later. My grandparents made the trip despite their health issues. Vernon sent an email congratulating me, proud in that reserved way men like him express feeling. My mother didn't show up. She didn't call. Not a single acknowledgement. As I stood in my cap and gown holding my diploma, I realized the closure I'd been waiting for wasn't coming. So I created my own. That evening, I deleted her number, blocked her accounts, blocked her email. Not because I hated her, but because I knew I could never grow if I kept a window open for someone who had locked every door on me. After graduation, I got a small job in Seattle. The pay was low, the apartment smaller than my dorm room, but it was mine. I kept studying, took every extra shift I could, jumped jobs whenever a better opportunity came along. Eventually, an offer from a tech company in Austin arrived, a chance to start fresh in a city that didn't know anything about me. I moved, worked myself past exhaustion, climbed every rung I could reach, and somehow I ended up being one of the youngest directors in the company. I only told 2 people, my grandparents and Vernon. It never occurred to me that one casual comment Vernon made at a family gathering would ripple its way back to Salem, then Seattle, then to the doorstep of my apartment, 12 years after I'd been told there was no place for me in my mother's home. And that ripple was what brought her to my door in Chapter 1. The apartment felt too quiet after she left. Hours had passed, but the faint scent of her perfume still clung to the air, mixing with the cold draft from the AC. The glass of water I'd given her sat untouched on the coffee table, catching the glow from the Austin skyline. I stared at it, trying to understand why my chest felt tight, why the silence bothered me more now than it ever had before. Maybe because this time the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. I replayed everything she'd said, how she'd glossed over 12 years of absence as if we'd simply drifted apart, how she'd gone straight to talking about Levi and Lyndon's tuition, how she spoke as if I had some overdue debt. She hadn't asked how I'd survived. She hadn't asked if I'd struggled. She hadn't asked anything. In her eyes, I had become a resource, someone who owed her for giving birth to me. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered how she learned where I lived. After pacing my living room a few times, I called Vernon. It took 2 rings before he answered, his voice warm but weary. He hesitated before telling me the truth. At a family gathering months earlier, my mother had cornered him asking about me. He'd mentioned my promotion, thinking he was sharing good news with a proud parent. He never imagined she'd turn that information into a map straight to my front door. He certainly didn't imagine she'd be calculating enough to ask about my salary, the size of my company, or where exactly I lived. Hearing that confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit aloud. She didn't come to reconnect. She came with a plan. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't recognize kept calling. When I finally picked up, it was Graham. His voice sounded strained, like he was talking in a room with thin walls. "I don't want trouble," he said. "But she's overwhelmed. If you could help pay part of the boys' tuition, maybe she'd calm down." I closed my eyes. "Did she tell you why I left home at 16? Silence. Then a heavy sigh. "We thought it was the right thing at the time." His use of "we" made something inside me twist. I pressed him harder. "Did she tell you she planned to send me away before the twins were even born?" He didn't answer for a while. And then in a low voice, he admitted that during the pregnancy, my mother had talked about reducing strain and making room for the children who needed them more. So it hadn't been an impulsive decision. It had been a strategy. And I'd been the expendable one. "I'm not paying," I said. "I paid for myself. I did everything alone." She made her choice. She doesn't get to undo it now. Before he hung up, Graham said something that lodged under my skin like a splinter. This won't be the end of it. She's not going to let this go. After the call, I stood at the window and watched the highway lights blur into long yellow streaks. The city felt loud even from up here. I remembered being 16, standing on another porch, hearing her say she needed to focus on the kids who mattered. And now here we were again, only this time, she wasn't just shutting a door. She was trying to force her way into mine. But I wasn't the boy she could push aside anymore. This time I wasn't going to avoid the confrontation. This time I was going to end it. A few days after my mother showed up at my door, I came home to find a plain envelope shoved under the crack. No name, no return address. Just my name written in rushed handwriting. Inside was a printed breakdown of Levi and Lyndon's tuition costs with a single sentence written across the top. This is your responsibility. Not a request, not a plea, a command. I set the papers on the counter, stared at them for a long minute, then slid them straight into the trash. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I didn't owe anyone anything. But the fact that she delivered this silently like a threat, slipped into a mailbox, told me this was only the beginning. The next morning, my company email buzzed with a long message from her personal account, then another from a different email, then another. Each one framed as a heart-wrenching confession about my childhood stories she twisted into reasons why I now owed her something. She wrote about working double shifts, about crying in the bathroom because my father left, about how I clung to her when I was bullied in elementary school. Except none of it sounded like memories. It sounded like evidence she was building a case on. Every warm moment of my childhood had been reworded as a sacrifice she made, and one I was required to repay. I blocked the email. Hours later, a new one appeared. I blocked that one too. By the fourth attempt, the dread from my teenage years started creeping back into me, the choking sense of being watched, judged, cornered. I had spent years wondering whether she saw me as a son or as a placeholder, and now I had the answer. I wasn't a person to her. I was leverage. Then one morning, while I was in the middle of reviewing a system proposal with my team, the receptionist called my office line, her voice tight. "Alder, there's a woman downstairs. She says she's your mother." My stomach dropped. The image of my mother shouting through the lobby, telling strangers my private business, flashed across my mind. I forced myself to breathe. "I'm not available," I said. "Tell her I'm traveling, and don't let her into the building." A beat of silence. "She won't leave," the receptionist whispered. "She says it's urgent." So I called my mother directly. She answered immediately, sounding breathless and triumphant, as if she'd expected me to cave. "You need to talk to me," she insisted. I told her if she didn't leave, I'd notify security. She tried arguing, guilt-tripping, demanding. But when I didn't budge, she finally stormed out. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. And something about that scared me more than if she'd cried. Minutes later, Graham texted, "I'm sorry." She left without telling anyone. I tried to stop her. So she had come to Austin behind everyone's back. 2 days after that, I returned home to find scratch marks around my door lock. Not enough to break in, but enough for me to understand the message she had tried. That night, I installed cameras around my entryway and hallway. I changed passwords, added alarms, upgraded the building security notifications. But none of it settled the unease settling in my bones. I was 30, working in a high-rise tech firm, but suddenly I felt 16 again, waiting for her to explode. I met with our company's legal advisor the next day. When I mentioned a restraining order, he sighed sympathetically. "If she hasn't harmed you or threatened violence, it's difficult. Continue documenting everything." It was maddening. I had to wait for something worse to happen just to earn protection. Late that evening, my phone buzzed with a call from Denver. It was Graham again. His voice cracked. She got into a huge argument with my parents. They said they don't want to see her anymore. I didn't know how to respond before he continued. "I think she's unraveling, Alder. And she keeps saying only you can fix this. That you owe her. That she can't live with what you've done." A chill rippled down my spine. The problem wasn't tuition. It wasn't money. It was obsession. Standing in my kitchen, I stared at the half-filled glass on my counter. My hand shook slightly the way it used to tremble when I was a kid bracing for her anger behind a closed door. Only this time, I wasn't a child, and I wasn't going to run. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about survival. If I didn't put an end to this, she would drag me right back into the life she once threw me out of. And this time, I wasn't going quietly. In the days that followed, I moved through my life as if someone had flipped on a spotlight behind me. I checked the hallway before stepping outside. I watched shadows twice before deciding they were real. I double-checked the locks before bed, even though I'd changed the codes that morning. I kept the security app open on my phone. Not because I thought she'd break in, but because I knew she thought she had the right to. No amount of alarms could protect me from a past that refused to stay buried. The week brought small disturbances, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. At the parking garage, someone lingered near my car, disappearing before I could make out their face. Late at night, faint tapping echoed through my door, but whenever I checked the peephole, the hallway was empty. My mailbox was pried open one afternoon, everything intact but shuffled. Someone wanted me to know they'd been there. My sleep fractured into short bursts. Every creak sounded like someone creeping down the hallway. Every shadow pulled me back to the feeling of being 16, expecting to be scolded, blamed, dismissed. Then one evening I heard a noise outside my apartment so soft it nearly blended with the hum of the hallway lights. I pulled up the camera feed. The image was grainy, but the figure was unmistakable. A person stood inches from my doorhead, tilted shoulders, rigid, watching. She stayed for several seconds. Then she stepped backward and vanished from the frame. I didn't need a clear picture. The posture, the nervous shifting, the slight tremor in the fingers, it was her. When I called Graham, he sounded defeated. She left Denver 3 days ago, he admitted. No one knew until she started calling around looking for you. I thanked him and hung up, though the conversation left a cold heaviness in my chest. If she had driven here alone, hiding it from everyone, she wasn't thinking rationally anymore. That night, I worked late. By the time I reached my floor, the hallway lighting was dimmer than usual. One of the bulbs had burned out, leaving half the corridor in shadow. I carried a bag of takeout in one hand, my keys in the other. That was when I heard breathing ragged, too quick to be casual, coming from the dark corner near my door. I stopped walking. "Mom," I said softly. "If that's you, step out." She stepped into the dim light, and for a moment I barely recognized her. Her hair was uncombed, her eyes swollen and wild, her clothes wrinkled like she'd been wearing them for days. She looked both desperate and determined. "Why did you make me come here?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger. "I kept my distance. You came because you wanted something." "You shut me out," she accused. "You made me an outsider in my own family." "You pushed me out first," I said. "You told me the twins deserved a life I didn't." She stepped closer, tears sliding down her face, but with no softness behind them. "I did what I had to do. You were old enough to understand." "I understand now," I said. "But understanding doesn't mean forgetting." Something shifted in her expression. Something sharp. When I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone, she lunged. She grabbed it so hard it flew from my hand and skidded across the floor. Before I could react, she shoved me backward. My shoulder hit the wall, then the floor. "You owe me," she screamed. "Everything I suffered was because of you. You ruined my life." Pain radiated through my side, but the shock ran deeper. I pushed myself up, catching her wrists before she could strike again. My heart hammered not with fear, but with a crushing grief I didn't know how to hold. The commotion must have echoed because 2 neighbors opened their doors. One elderly man rushed to restrain her, holding her back as she thrashed. Another called the police immediately. She kept shouting that I abandoned her, that I betrayed her, that I owed her. Even as her voice cracked, her eyes stayed locked on me, burning with something I couldn't name. When the police arrived, red and blue light filled the hallway. I felt the sting of blood on my forehead where I'd hit the wall. An officer handed me a cloth and asked what had happened. Standing there in the same spot where she'd once told me I didn't belong, I finally understood if I didn't take action. Now this cycle would never end. I wouldn't just be the teenager she discarded. I'd become the adult she believed she could still control. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked down the hall at her frail, furious trembling. She wasn't my mother in that moment. She wasn't someone I could reason with or reach. She was someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross. Yes, I said. I want to press charges, and I want a restraining order. I wasn't choosing revenge. I was choosing survival. I sensed something off the moment I stepped out of the elevator. The hallway was too still, and the faint trace of my mother's perfume lingered in the air. As I approached my door, I saw someone pressed against the wall, deliberately out of view of the camera. When she turned, it was her eyes, red face twisted with anger more than tears. "You can't be here," I said, keeping distance. "This building requires guests to check in. I have nowhere else to go," she snapped. "You need to listen to me." I stood near the elevator, making sure there was space between us. "If this is about tuition, my answer hasn't changed." She exploded. "You humiliated me. You tore this family apart." Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Graham took the boys. They left me. They think I'm unstable. Look what you did to your own mother." Her voice shook, but not from sadness, only rage. "If you hadn't abandoned us, this never would have happened. If you didn't hide your success, I wouldn't look like a failure." I felt the old guilt trying to claw its way back, but I shut it down. "You didn't lose your family because of me. You lost it because of the choices you made." She stepped toward me, reaching for my arm. "Let me inside. We need to talk like a family." I backed away. "We're not a family the way you want." That sentence broke something in her. She pounded on my door, shouting my name. When I pulled out my phone to call for help, she lunged. The phone flew out of my hand and cracked against the floor. Her nails scraped my collarbone as she grabbed my shirt. "You owe me, after everything I gave you." A neighbor across the hall flung his door open. "I'm calling the police." My mother screamed at him, then launched at me again. I had to hold her wrists to keep her from hurting either of us. For the first time, I wasn't scared, I was just exhausted. Sirens filled the hallway. 2 officers rushed in, shouting commands. It took both of them to restrain her. She fought until she couldn't anymore. When they asked if I wanted to press charges, I looked at her, trembling, furious, lost. "Yes," I said. "And I want a restraining order." Leaving home at 16 felt like the moment she abandoned me. But this was the moment I finally let her go. 2 days later, I sat with my attorney going over everything from the night I was forced out at 16 to the attack in my hallway. He told me I had more than enough for a restraining order. I signed without hesitation. That evening, Graham called. His voice was thick with guilt. "I should have stopped her years ago," he said. "I knew she wanted you gone long before the twins were born. I didn't speak up. I'm sorry." He said the boys knew about me and deserved to hear the truth, so I wrote them an email, honest but calm. I told them what happened, what their mother did, and that none of it was their fault. I didn't ask them to take my side. The next day, Levi replied with a single line, "I'm sorry. I understand now." Those 6 words healed something I didn't know was still broken. I flew to Salem to see my grandparents. They listened quietly. Then my grandfather said, "You did what you had to. You can't save people who refuse to save themselves." Later, my attorney forwarded me a message from my mother, the only way she could contact me. There was no apology. Just, "If you don't help me now, I don't know what will happen to me." I closed the email. I'd already answered that question with the life I built. Soon after, I moved to St. Petersburg to an apartment facing the water. On my first morning there, I sat on the balcony listening to the waves. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for the next crisis. I realized then I didn't survive because she left. I survived because I chose not to repeat her harm. And I stepped out of her life the same way she once stepped out of mine, the difference being that I did it to finally live.